Hello everybody, hope you're doing marvelously well. In this episode, we're going to be talking about mixing low end. This is an absolutely massively huge topic, so we're going to try and cover as much as possible and get behind all of the different issues you can have and how to solve them. There is a link here to a blog and a cheat sheet where you can download these as a PDF file and have all of the points that I am going through at your disposal at any time. So please click the link to do that. As ever, please hit the like button. If you haven't already, please subscribe. Go to producelikeapro.com, sign up for the email list, and you'll get a whole bunch of free goodies. Okay, so there is so much to talk about on this subject. I think the most important thing, the number one thing to talk about, is your monitoring. How are you hearing the low end? The fact is, you can't mix what you can't hear. If you don't hear those frequencies, you can't mix them. Yes, a subwoofer could be a useful thing to have. However, there are so many potential risks with the acoustics in your room. The only place you can guarantee that you should be able to make it sound good is in the seating position between the two speakers. If you've got speakers pointing here, that seating position should be what lots of people call the sweet spot. Now, with subs, you could potentially get all kinds of problems with low end being too aggressive or too soft, and you're compensating for it. Ultimately, a subwoofer is a great thing, but I almost feel like you need it once you've learned your speakers in your room a little better. Acoustic treatment is an important thing. Not everybody can afford it initially, and not everybody fully understands it. There's a lot of mumbo jumbo talked about it, but ultimately you don't want to be in a massively reverberating room. You don't want standing waves where frequencies seem to be really boosted. You want to be in a place where it feels pretty flat. So I know the question you're asking yourself, and to be honest, it's the question I asked of myself when I first started. How are you going to know when it sounds good? Many people, believe it or not, mix in rooms that don't sound that great, that aren't completely flat, that aren't anechoic chambers. They work in environments that have all kinds of challenges but still manage to get great results. I've been to mix rooms with really well-known mixers and not understood how the mix sounds until I take it to an environment I know and trust, and then I can hear it. In their rooms, I'm a little confused. There maybe seems to be too much low end or not enough low end. And then I go to a room that I feel is flatter, maybe I'm wrong, but I go to a room and it makes sense to me. What's the lesson in that? The lesson in that is like those people are mixing in rooms that they understand. And maybe the rooms do have issues and they've overcome them. You can't mix what you can't hear. So that would point to maybe using a subwoofer. I don't know if that's something I would recommend straight off the bat. I think if you're using small drivers like 4, 5 or 6 inch monitors, the last thing you want to do with those small speakers is put a whole bunch of low end through them and not know what they're doing. So if you can't hear it through those little speakers, don't just sit there and keep turning up the low end and continuously until it starts to feel really good. Because the reality is like if you're starting to hear, 20, 40, 60 hertz pumping through a 4-inch speaker, then take that mix out to the car and it's going to blow your head off. The whole thing is just going to be, the car is going to be shaking. If you can't hear it, don't go down there and try and deal with it. There's plenty of things you can do, like high passing. We'll get to that in a minute. But as far as boosting, don't boost frequencies you can't hear. So now you're probably confused and saying, well, how am I going to mix that? Well, that's where headphones are really quite useful. I have Blue headphones and I have Odyssey headphones. Both of them I absolutely love. The Odyssey headphones are super flat and responsive, and I actually have a model of my room that I'm able to hear on the Odyssey headphones, which is really fantastic. But they are an open back headphone and they're really super accurate. So I love them. But what I love about the Blue headphones is they're closed and they actually have a hyped low end. Now you're probably thinking, well, why would you want something with a hyped low end? Well, I can work on those a little easier. A little bit of extra lift, just a tiny bit down there, is my way of hearing some of those super lows. And so I'm able to move between speakers and headphones and get a really good balanced mix. And I've mixed many, many times. If you've been watching some of my live streams, I mix on headphones all the time now. And I've been doing that because I want to demonstrate and live in a world where many of you are living, where you have to work on headphones. Maybe you're living with your parents still. Maybe you have kids and you're working, at night after work and you don't want to wake them up. So you're on headphones. It's really possible. Or you're in a small apartment and you don't want to annoy the neighbors. I mean, headphones are a reality. There's been a lot of discussion about headphones. Apparently they're like, year over year, sales are going through the roof on headphones. So it's the future. So actually mixing on headphones, although not necessarily ideal, isn't a bad thing, because the reality is a lot of your clients are going to end up listening to the music that you work on headphones. It's all about balance. Don't boost what you can't hear. Find the headphones with the extended low end, and these are closed back headphones, and that will help you. Don't be afraid to check. The best mixers in the world have boomboxes in their rooms, have 3 or 4 sets of speakers, have other rooms that they go to listen to playback. And then, honestly, I've worked with a couple of guys I absolutely admire, and they go and sit in their cars and listen. So I know there's a lot of mumbo jumbo talking about, oh, don't do this and don't do that. Well, you know what? All of the best people do. Whatever it takes. That's really the answer. Whatever it takes to get the mix sounding great. You will eventually get to know your room. You'll understand what translates to other places. So you'll be working on a mix and you'll feel to yourself, well, if I boost this area here and cut this and all these different things that you learn, you'll go away, you'll start feeling it translates into other environments, you'll come back and you'll start getting a system in place. I do not go to the car anymore. I don't turn on a subwoofer anymore. I know how to make the low end sound good in this room. Through a combination of speakers and headphones, mainly the speakers, but the headphones as well, I can get the low end to be just what I want it to be. I think one of the most important things, and I hope I say this enough, cut yourself some slack. The likelihood of you being in an incredibly acoustically treated, amazing sounding room with a pair of $10,000 a side speakers in the perfect seating position is pretty remote. And quite frankly, so is that for most professional mixers. They're not sitting in the most ideal situations. They're just sitting in places that they know really well and they know how to get it to sound good. The most important thing about mixing low end is it's the last thing that everybody gets. It really is. We have an amazing online community. We have the Produce Like a Pro Academy. And it's the number one thing where people come in. They start getting the mid-range detail and panning and all that stuff. But the one thing we're always talking about initially when they come in is how to help them getting that low end to just feel right. And it's everybody. I was in another online community a couple of years ago, and I was bemused by that because I realized that not everybody understands how to get a beautiful, full sounding low end. And we all know, it doesn't matter whether you're doing EDM or reggae or just straight ahead classic rock or metal, low end is really, really important. Everywhere we go now, sound systems are amazing. If you go and see live shows now, it's nothing like it was 20 years ago. Now the sound systems are incredible. So your music, if it's played through that, has to be really, really well mixed on the low end. You can walk through malls and go in and out of stores. I've been in stores that have the most incredible sound systems that just blow away what I used to hear. Everything is moving rapidly, everything is improving. The base price of equipment is getting cheaper and cheaper. So with all of that, with some teething problems, there's always going to be teething problems, but ultimately everything is getting better. Everything eventually is going to sound better. I'm always optimistic about this. So you have plenty of opportunity to check out your low end, and you have plenty, most importantly, a reason to get it right. Number 2, this is personally a big one for me. Not all low end tips are created equal. You're like, what does he mean? Okay, I've watched a schnizzle ton of videos on low end. I thought, I'm going to do this video on low end, and I'm going to go out there and see what information is there. So I went through a lot. And I would say, I don't want to exaggerate, but at least 90% of them used programmed drums, virtual instruments, or bass guitars that weren't really bass guitars, bass synths, all of this stuff. All of which is absolutely fantastic, but that is only addressing a part of the problem. If I've got a bass synth that's literally going do, 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 playing exactly a blob of bass, compression is not an issue. If I'm using a program kick, which is the same every time, going thump, 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 half of the things that we're talking about here aren't even addressed in those videos. No disrespect, because obviously dance music and EDM and programmed drums and all this stuff is really, really important, but it's only part of the story. When you get a live drummer, for instance, the kick can be kick, 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 kick. It can be here, 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 all over the place. There can be 6 dB minimum dynamics between hits. I've seen all kinds of things. And not only that, when a drummer plays a kick drum, depending how the beater hits the kick, it can give you a completely different sound. If I take the beater and lay it into it, it goes click, and it just does this thud. But if I allow the beater to come back immediately afterwards, it gets more of a boom, boom, it rings. You get thud, thud, and boom, boom. The reality is, in a drum performance, with the exception of a handful of the best drummers you can work with, most drummers will do a bit of both. So you might get boom, 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 thud, 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 boom. And so all of that, with the dynamics as well, creates all kinds of issues. So yes, there's some fantastic tips out there. But when it comes to things like acoustic drums and now bass guitars, when a bass player plays, say, an open string softly, the low end is gorgeous because that string just vibrates gorgeously. Now, maybe they play that same open string but slap it really hard or play the pick really hard, and suddenly that string hits the fretboard on the neck. Guess what happens? All the low end disappears. It kind of goes flat. They play too hard. Down, they're hitting it really super hard. It's just fretting out. It's just reducing the movement of the string, hitting the fretboard. All the low end disappears. So, a great bass player, like somebody like Dan Rothschild. I remember the first time I worked with him, I could not believe how even he was. I was barely compressing at all because he had played the same bass his whole life. I believe it's like a 72 or 73 P bass, and I think he bought it new, or if he didn't buy it new, he got it like a year old. And that's his bass. That's what he tracks everything on. So he knows just how hard to play it, and in each different position. He knows whether maybe the bass resonates a lot and then maybe doesn't resonate quite enough, and he knows how to get that one bass to sing everywhere across the neck. That is rare. That is super rare. Even some of the best bass players in the world, they might pick up your bass and it sounds great and they love the way it distorts, or they love some characteristic about it, but they're not going to know it intimately like Dan knows his bass. So you're going to get an uneven performance. Maybe a great bass player, it's not quite so uneven, but with a less experienced player, they're going to get a massively uneven performance. So yes, you've got tips on mixing bass synths, tips on mixing virtual basses. All of those are fantastic. However, they're not reproducing the reality of mixing a live bass. If you're mixing a live bass, you're going to do a lot of different tips and tricks. So you need to learn a lot of things to get this. So for instance, here is a combination of live and programmed drums. You can hear and you can see how uneven it is, but I'm doing all kinds of things to help that. So if I turn off everything on the drum sub, for instance, for a second, and just listen to the live kick. Here's the live kick on its own. I mean, it got super quiet there. He's laying the beater on it, so there's no it's just dud, 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 dud. Needs a lot of work. So the first EQ moves there is like massively drastic, pulling out low mids. All of this low mid here. So a huge amount of EQ was done on that. And then the other thing we can do is even out. Here, if we go and listen to this where it gets super dynamic, it got so quiet there. So I'm probably going to want to put on a bit of compression. So I can go in there and grab a compressor. And if I go to that section there where it's quite dynamic to where it's not dynamic, See here in this area here is when the super quiet ones are. So let's just go to that, just tap those. So what I've just done there is just apply a bit of compression so that those quieter ones can now sort of shine a little bit. And that's just a reality, which is not something I'm going to worry about with say, a synth kick, which we have before here. It's programmed. The same every single time. So I don't have to do the same treatment at all. And then I have a programmed kick from Addictive Drums here. And you can see how massively even that is. This is one of those things when we're talking about not everything is created equal. The tips and tricks that I'm going to do on this would be completely different. I'm not worrying about, using compression on a synth kick, which is the same each time. And if I was applying compression, it might be to do an interesting effect. And the EQ I would apply would be for different methodology and would be consistent. I could say they're a cut and boost EQ that would remain the same on every single hit. We end up using dynamic EQ and multiband compressions quite a lot on organic stuff because it varies so much. It's a tip that's used quite often on bass guitar, because maybe that big woofy low note, like on an A flat or something, is blowing up, and then everywhere else it's barely in at all. Not a problem you're going to have on a synth bass line like we have here. I mean, the dynamic range of that is so limited. It's great, but it's just literally the same hitting every single time, not giving me the problems of dynamics that I would with the bass. So to illustrate what I'm talking about, for instance, here's a C sharp on an A string. You hear it bottoming out? Not much low end. I can go open E, or I can loud, but the low end's disappearing. So we're going to have to find a way of boosting the low end. The octave, again. If I played that C sharp now, here, I actually got a lot more low end on the E string. I know a lot of producers, myself included, who like to keep things on one string if you can, because it gives you a more even tone. You can go. I hit that B a little hard and it was... These are things when you're playing live you don't even think about. You're out there, you're like rocking out. In the studio, you want to be even. And look, as soon as I get a pick, for instance, all heck is going to break loose. Yeah, so you can see there's all kinds of issues. Let us track just the chorus part here. Cool, so simple octave line. Let's have some fun with this and see what we have to do to get it to sound even. I'm not going to win any awards for performance, but you can see it's a little uneven. I'll probably just quickly cut and paste one bit. Here you see let's just take this part here and put it here where I flubbed a note a bit. It's quieter on some notes, louder on others. There wasn't any compression going on the way in to even it up, but ultimately it was my performance is just a little bit uneven. And yeah, there's definitely some great things about that, but nothing compared with the program bass. So you can see it's like incredibly different. So we're gonna have to do some work on that. We'll get to that in a second. Number 3, I think this one is a really good one when you're starting off. Use a frequency analyzer. So if you go to your master bus, and there's some really old-fashioned ones that I still love, like the Paz. There's tons of really flashy modern ones, but I've been using this one for years. I can go now and listen to the low end, say on this program bass. Pretty darn even. Let's go and listen to my live bass. You see what I'm talking about. A frequency analyzer is really going to help you. You'll be able to hear and see what's going on. I mean, for instance, just being able to see the low lows that you can't hear through your little speakers is going to be massive. I mean, if you've got this huge spike at 20 or 30 hertz that you can't hear through your little speakers, frequency analyzer will show it to you. Don't get me wrong, it's not a tool for making everything completely even. It's not all about making it look like 20 hertz to 20K, like all this and beautiful and even. It's not what you want. Music is not like that. Music has spikes of mid-range and aggression, and wrongness is fantastic. However, when you're doing things like low end, it's a beautiful thing to see where there might be some weird spikes that you have to tame, especially if your speakers are not telling you. If the low end disappears for a second, you can't figure it out, you've got the frequency analyzer to go, oh look, it's dipping here. Highly recommend one. I think it's a great tool for identifying issues. And then when you listen in other environments, you can go, oh, I hear what was being shown to me by that frequency analyzer. There's plenty of them on the market. There's some for free. Probably your DAW comes with one. You don't have to use the Paz. It's just something I've been using forever. But I highly recommend it. And quite a few plugins these days come with a frequency analyzer built in. Number 4, we did touch on this at the beginning. Don't boost what you can't hear. If you've got these 4-inch, 5-inch, 6-inch speakers, maybe even sometimes as much as an 8, you're not going to hear 20 to 40 hertz. You might in an 8 get a little bit of a touch of it. That's okay. But in those small speakers, you're not going to hear it. So don't boost those super lows. If they're not in the speaker, if you come to a point where you're boosting it so much, what you'll end up doing is having an enormous amount in another environment. You'll go to a car test or you'll play it through a big system and the low end will be monstrously huge. And then you'll come back to your little 4, 5, 6, even 8-inch speakers and be like, oh, it sounds even. Therein lies the problem. So don't boost what you can't hear. Go to places where you can hear it, or use headphones, like we're talking about closed back headphones. Use those. If they've got a little extra, a little extra bump in the low end, that's actually not a problem. Because if you are mixing through your little speakers and you do boost a schnizzle ton of low end, put on those headphones and they will literally blow up with the amount of low end. So another reason why I think moving between speakers and headphones is actually a very, very good idea in a small studio environment. Number 5, I talk about this in every single video, it feels like. Don't be afraid to high pass. High passing is your friend. If you've got a ton of instruments and vocals and all kinds of stuff that have excessive low end, even if it's not audible in your little speakers, high passing it out the way is beautiful because it will let the true low end breathe naturally. If you've got a kick drum, a bass drum, depending on where you're from, just sitting underneath, and then you've got a bass just slightly above that, nice and full. Maybe there's some guitars and synths that have some low on it, but those lows could kind of disappear by about 100 hertz, maybe even 150, and then just let the low lows happen from the kick, the bass drum, or the bass guitar, or the bass synth, whatever you're using. It's really, really important. And there's many other reasons as well why you want to high pass. But essentially, if you can high pass things and create some room, your low end will be super clear. I've talked about this a lot, but I'll mention it again. Imagine if you've got a synthesizer that has a huge amount of like 60 to 80 on the low end, but it's not a bass synth. Let's just pretend it's a stereo synth with this big fat low end, but you also have a synth bass line going. Waveforms, you know, are pretty big when they're low frequencies, as you know. They travel in like huge, huge cycles. Now, imagine you've got these big waveforms and you've got a big fat synthesizer playing, and then now you've also got a bass synth. All it needs is for one waveform to look like this, and then the other one to look like this, and it doesn't even have to be exactly opposite. And yes, they're going to cancel each other out. So you don't get more low end. You can actually get less low end, less clarity when there's a whole bunch of things fighting for the same area. You won't get a fuller sound. You'll end up with this big lump of mud down there. So you want to clean it up down there and give it definition. And then you can have that kick, that bass drum just full. You can have that bass synth or that bass guitar just be full. And then you can just glue it together with other synths or guitars. And suddenly that whole low end just starts to feel really tough and really, really huge. So don't be afraid to high pass. High pass is your friend. Number 6, evening out the low end on organic instruments. Now, this is a big deal. We have just recorded an electric bass. It could be a stand-up bass, it could be a contrabass, double bass, whatever you want to call it, but it's a bass, and as you heard earlier when I performed it, it's a little uneven. As we were talking about, a bass synth that we have controlled, you know, with MIDI and made very even is perfect on the song. It sounds great. It's hitting the same every single time. Now, a bass DI, not so much. So there's a couple of things I can do. I'm going to show you the tips that I've done quite a few times with electric basses, but we'll do it again. I'm actually going to shift Option D. So I've actually duplicated that section now. And I am going to take this top one here, and I'm going to grab an EQ, and I am going to get rid of everything above 200. I'm going to low pass it. So that's low passing, so the low end is allowed to pass through. You could call it high cut or low pass. So now that is just playing low end. If I go to the other one, I'm going to do the reverse. So I can actually make it 200 here. So I can just type in 200. I can do the opposite. So now the other DI I've got. Now, why am I doing this? I'm doing it for some fun reasons. I don't want distortion on my low end. I want my low end to be really, really super fat. I want it to be clean, and a DI is perfect for that. If I had an amp track, I would be doing crazy, weird things on the amp track. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to immediately just put some compression on it. We'll just grab something generic, like an R comp. You can use whatever compressor you have in your DAW. Doesn't have to be the exact same one I use. I'm going to apply a little bit of compression. So we'll go like 3 or 4 to 1. So immediately I've taken that DI that I've turned into a low end only, and I've compressed it. So it's starting to get nice and even. If I go to the other one, I can have some fun with it. I'm using this as like my amp track. It's the duplicated DI. So why don't I go and grab some kind of saturation? So we can go and grab a Sans amp, which comes free with Pro Tools. It's just a saturator. I'm sure you have one in your DAW. So let's give that some drive. So a little bit of drive there, I actually like that. And then I'm going to actually copy this compressor down here. So now I've got the compression on the saturated track. Set a bit more aggressively. Blend the two together. Definitely more low end. So if I just take If I mute this second one for a second, take off these plugins, have a listen to where we started. Now go back to where we just ended up. Just nice, full, controlled low end. Now, another thing we might want to do is just bus those two together. So let's take bus 21, which is not being used, create a mono subgroup or auxiliary or bus, whatever you want to call it. And now those two elements are coming into one input. Everything I've done there is specific for a live instrument. I'm controlling the dynamic range of it far more aggressively than I would if this was a program bass line. I actually didn't put any compression on that vacuum bass sound. I just put a bit of the Goldfuss on there just to even out some of the highs, just to control it, but it was really pretty minor. What we're doing here is a lot more aggressive. I'm going to grab a compressor so I can compress both the signals together. Again, I'll go for an R-comp, a Renaissance compressor, which is a very, very inexpensive, like I say, you can use a stock compressor if you like. And I'll give a similar amount of compression. There's three levels of compression here. There's a bus compressor of the two elements going in, and then each of those two elements has its own compression. So already it's starting to even out my performance. It's also evening out maybe where a string wasn't ringing as much. Next thing I will grab is an EQ, and I can just use something really basic like this. And I'm going to go to about 60 where the kick would live and just have a very gentle slope. So it will allow the kick drum to breathe in this area here. There's also another reason for doing this, is because I'm going to go into the Waves R bass. This is a secret weapon of mine. It's not secret for any mixer I know. We all love this because the R bass does something quite special. So what I'm doing is I'm controlling the low end going into the R bass. Reason for me doing that is because this is going to boost some low lows, and I don't really want to bring in a lot of extra low end, because if it's boosting 80 like I'm doing it at the moment, it's also going to boost below that. So 60 and 40 is going to get pulled up quite a lot as well. So if I shape it going in, I'm sending in it high passed a little bit. That 60 and 40 that's coming up is not as aggressive as if I hadn't high passed going into it. And that's just great. That's just adding some sort of super, super low lows there. Another plugin that I absolutely love is the MV2. A lot of people will parallel their bass guitar, which I totally understand. You could parallel it, compress it really aggressively. I saw a video talking about that. That's an amazing technique, and I've done it many times before, and then bring it up alongside. However, the MV2 with this low-level control is going to do that for me. It's going to allow the low-level information to get extra compressed and come up underneath, hence this. And then the high level is going to come in and squash it down over the top. But you're going to bring the output down, it's going to get quite aggressive. It's great, even where there was that huge drop off there where I was playing super soft, or here. So even where I was sort of, fretting out a bit, I wasn't really playing very evenly, it solved it for me. So pretty remarkable. Now I like the grit and the distortion on it. I'm not going for a clean bass sound. I've already got the synth bass doing that. There it is, it's great. Now I can blend those two bass sounds together, and what I might do is take off some lows or scoop out an area for the two to sit together. And that would be fun. That's where a frequency analyzer can come in, because we don't want too much of a build-up in the same area. Or I could decide to only use one or the other. Both of those things are very valid. Let's just hear that with the drums. One of the things I'd also like to mention about the R bass is it generates additional harmonics in octaves. So if I've got an 80 going on there, it will do a 160, a 320, etc., etc. That also gives it more personality. So it leads me to another thing when it comes to low end. This is a big one. Could have put this right at the beginning. It's not all about the low end. Yes, of course, this is a video on low end, but our ear gravitates towards it if it's got a bit of pizzazz, a bit of saturation, a bit of high mids, a bit of presence, something like I did there, putting some distortion on that just helps the bass sit apart. I don't just want a bass sound that goes boom, 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 boom. I don't want a kick that just goes boom, boom, boom. It needs some click on the kick. That could be anywhere for like 2.5, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7K on metal kicks. 2.5's great for rock. You know, I know on funk kicks they'll go for like 1 or a 1.5K, you know, just to harden it up a little bit. There's all kinds of different things you can do. But those mid-range and high mids are there for bass guitars and kick drums to give it a little bit of a point. So you hear that kick going, you kind of hear the click, click, click. And that helps your ear identify it. So the low end is reinforced by a bit of attack from the kick, a bit of grind from the bass. So remember that, that's very, very important. And when you're on your small speakers, you should be able to hear that pretty evenly. That's another thing to do when you go to earbuds. Check them on the earbuds and you can hear like some of that little grit and grime and that attack. It's a really good way to pinpoint and focus in on the bass, the low end. It happens with synths as well. Put some grit on that bass synth, just so it feels like it's there. Some people take like a sine wave bass synth, take off any high end from it whatsoever, and then use a doubled up synth sound that plays along with the bass sound. There's maybe a sawtooth synth and then blend it together. So you've got the low fat synth and a sawtooth synth playing like same kind of effect that we just did with the bass guitar. So remember, presence, mid-range, high mids is going to make those instruments stand out of the mix and help reinforce what is going on in the low end. Otherwise, you'll just keep turning the low end up on the bass, trying to get it louder. Quite often when I'm mixing, a bass player will say, I can't hear my bass. The low end might be absolutely perfect, but it just sits in the track and it reinforces the guitars and reinforces the kick and it's fat and beautiful. But the bass player is saying, I can't hear my bass. What they're telling you is they can't hear the definition on the bass. So I'll boost those high mids. I might even start like 700, 750, 8, 850, 1K, 1.5, and then start looking at the 3, 4, 5 area just to kind of give it a little bit of nose. Trying to bring out some of the fingers, trying to bring out a little bit of the grit of the high mids. And suddenly they're like, oh, my bass is louder. Now I can hear it. So that is a way to make an instrument more focused, because obviously our ears are more sensitive to the high mids, without just sitting there and turning it up so that it's just blowing up the speakers with too much low end. 7, keep your low lows mono. Now there's quite a few plugins. Ozone in particular has a way of focusing just the low end, but there's a lot of them on the market. You can say everything below 150 or 200 only comes down the middle. I know for a lot of mastering engineers that have to cut vinyl, it's a must for them to get that low end focused down the middle. Or don't use a plugin and mix it that way. Mix it so that you've got bass drum, kick drum, bass guitar, bass synth, whatever you want to call it, just pumping low end down the middle. Take your guitars, take your synths, etc., pan them left and right, create some width, and wipe off 100, 150, even up to 200. And not only will it sound more powerful because the low lows are down the middle, it will also sound wider. It will sound wider because the low lows will feel mono. And so if you have guitars with, say, nothing below 150 or even as much as 200 on acoustics and stuff, they will stay more in the speaker. They will sit there. They will sit in their place. You start putting a lot of low lows in them, they sort of start to morph into the middle. They don't feel like they're just sort of sitting in the mid-range and the tweeters over here. They start feeling like they're sort of somewhere blurred in the middle. So it's good for many, many reasons. Low end, focus down the middle, mid-range, high mids and everything firmly in their place on the guitars and the synths and everything, the pianos and everything over here. You can get some really, really wonderful wide sounding mixes by keeping the lows directly down the middle. And again, it's high passing gently. I'm not suggesting that these are all like high pass shelves that are like this. I'm saying go to like 150 on a guitar and do this. Give me a gentle slope, just like a little slope. Just get it out of the way of the bass guitar, a little bit out of the way of the bass synth, a bit out of the way of that kick, bass drum, whatever you want to call it, just get it out of the way of that. Just so it feels more like it's coming out harder left and right, getting some width and allowing that kick and that low end from all of the instruments that are reinforcing it to just breathe down the middle. Like I said, you can use it in plugins, and maybe that's not a bad idea, but don't mix waiting for a plugin on the master bus to solve that issue. Which brings us to the last point, number 8. Solve the problems of your mix inside of the mix and don't try to solve them on the master bus. I know there's a lot of talk about that top-down mixing, and I've seen lots of videos on it, and there is a obvious reality that if you put like multiband compression or ozone and compressors and EQs and limiters across your master bus and then just mix into it, you can keep pushing things in, turning them up, push them in, push them in, push them in, and balance it all out. And then the multibands and all the clever, wonderful plugins that we have now will sit there and even it out so it always sounds even sonically. So you don't get like too much bass, low end blowing up, you don't get too much high mids, all this kind of stuff. However, you won't get a very good sounding mix. You'll get a very soft sounding mix because when a guitar gets too loud, it will duck the high mids. Meaning it will duck the high mids on absolutely everything. It's a global, it's like sitting there, like I said, just like pushing all of the high mids down so they're even. Down comes the electric guitars, but so does the high mids on the vocals, and suddenly everything just starts to sound really, really soft. So go in and find out where the issues are coming from. If you've got low end, which is out of control, go back in and find it. Do you need to do some more high passing? Do you need to go to your bass guitar or your kick drum or whatever it is that's causing the problem and get it to be more even so it hits more evenly and more continuously even across the whole track and not just blowing up? Because obviously you can get build up. You can get a kick, bass and a synth all hitting at the same point, and sometimes they get a little bit out of control. So maybe there's a low note on the synth that just needs to be ducked when it hits that low note. Therefore, instead of ducking the mix in the low end at that point, you present yourself a nice, beautiful, even mix that is more controlled going to your mix bus. Don't solve your problems on the mix bus. Great, put the frequency analyzer on there, find issues, but don't use the mix bus to solve the problem. You can high pass on a mix bus. You can, but I rarely do. And if I do, it's like 20 hertz and it's a really gentle slope. So maybe I'll go to 20 hertz and then maybe do a very, very gentle slope. And it's purely because I might be worried about 10 or 5, whatever, some really super lows that might blow up some speakers. But the reality is like if I've controlled everything in my mix, by the time it gets to my master bus, there shouldn't be any rumbling of a vocal mic. There shouldn't be any air conditioning in my acoustic guitar. All of that stuff's been removed and high passed out before it gets there. There shouldn't be kicking of a mic stand going boom. None of that stuff will be in my master bus because I have mixed the elements leading up to the master bus. So yes, you can do things on the master bus, but save that for mastering. Save that for mastering. Try to get your mix as beautiful as you can at the very, very end. And then all of those little mini fixes that you may have to do are a mastering stage, not a mix stage. Well, thank you ever so much for watching. Please download the cheat sheet. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing. And please leave a whole bunch of comments and questions below. Let us know what your low-end experiences are, because this is a huge, huge topic, and I love to share ideas with everybody. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing. Please download the 8 tips below. There's a cheat sheet down there. Hit the like button. Leave me a bunch of comments and questions. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing. And I'll see you all again very, very soon.